Hey to all of you guys out there in Zoom land. I'm Saraya Wintersmith. I'm a local reporter based in Boston. And on behalf of the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, I want to welcome you and say thank you for joining us today for this timely discussion on racism and journalism. I want to let you know that we will open up the discussion for questions. So if you have an inquiry for our guest, write it up and drop it in the chat box and we'll get to it. I am thrilled about our guest today. Soledad O'Brien is a world-class journalist, veteran, been in the media industry for the last 3 decades.
No, I sound so old. Where are we going with this? Holy cow, this is going off the rails already. We started off
much of an introduction, but the people need to know you have such knowledge.
She's old. She's old and she's old.
That's not it. You were knowledgeable, you were seasoned, and you were good, and you've won so many awards. You went on to found your own production company, and now you host Matter of Fact, and lots of people fangirl you. Like,
I love that.
More than 1 million followers on Twitter. In addition,
a lot of them, probably 500,000 are bots, so I'm not sure it counts at all.
In addition to being a speaker and a philanthropist, she's obviously very bright and quick. And we're going to have a great conversation today. Mrs. O'Brien, thank you so much for your time.
Really. It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you for allowing me to drink wine in the middle of our conversation.
It's fine. We love you with reason. It's perfectly fine. You recently penned your op-ed for the New York Times on the topic of racism in newsrooms, where you disclosed that your colleagues were referring to you openly as an affirmative action hire. Talk about your decision to write that piece. I think we've obviously seen multiple headlines about newsrooms getting things wrong and mistreating journalists of color. Was there a particular inspiration for you to write that piece, and what were you hoping to accomplish with it?
They had reached out, actually, and just asked if we had something to, if I wanted to share anything about the experience. And it's so funny because that was kind of how I began, but it's so normal to me. Like, that's not an unusual conversation. Most of the people who I know who are my age, who've worked in newsrooms, have had some version of that conversation where you stumble upon your colleagues all talking and you realize, as I did in the middle, they're talking about the new affirmative action hire, and it's you. And you're like, oh, and that's awkward because you kind of tried to awkwardly slide into the conversation because you have no friends because you're new in the community, and you're like, oh, we're talking about me. But it wasn't a traumatic experience. It wasn't even a bad experience. It was just kind of typical. And I wanted to, I think what they were interested in at the New York Times, which was a good experience for me to write that op-ed, was just a very unflinchingly honest look at race from a person's perspective who's written and reported and done a lot of documentaries about race, but also who could kind of tell the truth because I'm self-employed. I work, I don't have any non-exclusive deals, and that allows me to kind of do what I want in a sphere. So I think they felt like she will feel free to talk about some things that other people might want to pull punches on because she doesn't, sort of work for one kind of employer. And so I tried to be honest about both the data points around race and some of the personal experiences I had. In many of the places that I worked at were great places. I mean, I've had really a wonderful career and I've had great experiences, but there's no question when it came to race, a lot of my colleagues were really challenged. And a lot of those conversations about race were important to what we were covering in the newsroom. They weren't kind of an aside that was irrelevant and didn't matter. They were conversations about what was happening in the newsroom as well.
After reading your piece, I think many younger journalists of color were curious about how you were navigating that newsroom experience. I heard you say that it wasn't particularly bad, it was just typical. So were you having to cope at all with people just being openly insensitive?
I think any journalist of color in a majority white newsroom, of course, has to cope. I mean, or in a majority white office space. Yeah. People talk a lot about microaggressions, and it's a word I hate because it sounds so clinical. It sounds like you should go see your dermatologist. Like, oh, I think I might have some microaggressions. I think it's a little more insidious than that. And so my strategy, which I don't think is everybody's strategy, but my strategy has been twofold. One is to both try to raise awareness of it, but also to try to block it out, because I do think and the advice I give to a lot of young people is, I do think when you are so focused on these relatively small little digs that happen pretty much constantly, you end up losing your focus of what you wanted to accomplish in your career. And so I've always tried to very intentionally kind of like, this is over here, but my path is this direction. I always tell the story of a guy, his name was John, I won't name him. But when I used to work at WBZ, which was my first job, I was an associate producer. And I did the show that came on right before the Today Show. So that show, Today Show, launched at 7:00. So we finished our morning show, and then I would run back down to have the morning meeting, stop at the bathroom, because I finished right with the handoff to the Today Show. And so I'd come into the morning meeting late, 7:05, every day, 5 minutes late. And this guy, John, used to every day comment on the fact that I was running on CP, colored people's time. I was 5 minutes late. And I'm like, well, I'm coming from the control room, which is, down the way. And I was so mad. I literally used to go home and think of ways, like when he says this, I'm going to say this. And then when he does that, what I'm going to do is this. And I've got this good snarky remark. Oh, I wish I'd said this. I spent so much time so worried about, like, what would my witty comeback to John be? I'm so nice. All these years I have not named him. I really should. But I haven't. But you know what?
Very nice.
And then I left that station and I never saw him again. I've never seen him again, which in our business is unusual. Usually you bump into people again in some capacity. And I remember thinking, like, I cannot believe I wasted all this psychic energy on someone who ultimately, like, it was a complete waste of time. It was a complete waste of time. Why did I bother to do that? And so I've tried to, that was my first job in Boston. I've tried to really advise people, like, don't waste your time on stupid people who do not matter. It's really important to not, to not get kind of thrown off your game or move your eyes off of the prize just because you're mad at something somebody has said. And microaggressions, I feel, often fall into that category. They're small, they're annoying. Most people you tell them to, your Black friends will be like, I see that. Your white friends will be like, what? Oh, he was joking. Oh, come on. Are you really that sensitive? Come on. Whatever. So, I've really just learned, I think, and pretty early on, to just go this way. And not that microaggressions aren't hurtful to people. I think they are, certainly in the aggregate. But I try not to put my energy into them because you just waste a lot of your time.
It's good to know that you went on to become the renowned media professional that you are. I wonder.
Meanwhile, John, we've never seen again.
Karma.
I'm just saying, the Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?
I wonder, though, if the situation ever escalated to the point where you had to evaluate whether or not you would file an HR report.
No, I mean, the days were very different then than now, for sure. Nobody was particularly racially sensitive. So people you probably would have been a little bit laughed out of a room for racial sensitivity. Like, that wasn't a thing. No one talked about racial sensitivity. So it was a very different time. No, it never would have occurred to me to file an HR report. Remember, when I started, this was 31 years ago, people were sexually harassing people. And women were trying to decide, do they go and report that? Because they weren't sure, would HR back them up if they talked about a person who was grabbing them? I mean, I had a friend who, would constantly be groped by people. And she really was like, I'm not sure I should complain, because she didn't think HR would back her up.
Wow.
That's the time that was in late 1980s. So a lot has changed since then. I also think, today, I imagine that in a meeting and someone said that, 3 other colleagues, I wouldn't even have to say anything, 3 other colleagues would jump on that person. I really truly believe that. I think if I were in a meeting today and someone did that in front of me, not to me, but to somebody else, we would all jump on that person and make it clear that that was not acceptable. That's the kind of thing that just didn't happen years ago. And so I don't even think, I thought it was a big deal. I think we thought it was, this guy's kind of a jerk.
Is your friend that was dealing with groping still working in news?
She continued to work in the newsroom. She was an editor. And so one of the things that would happen would be that people would come in behind her and do a lot of touching, running their hands down her back, and over her shoulders. Again, this was, and so she was a few years older than me. And so she had been dealing with it from the 1980s and 1970s even, as a female editor who worked so completely unusual in the 1970s. So I think she was, you know, her position was, I don't know, do I report it? There's a good chance I'll lose my job. And that was by the end of the 1980s. And she wasn't wrong, you know? So to me, the answer was always, that's very realistic. I'm not going to tell you that you're not going to lose your job, because you probably will. That's just how it works nowadays, back in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. So things have changed very dramatically. But no, I never felt the need to go to HR. Even looking back now, there was never a point. I did, you know, very much have the whole sensibility around, like, okay, so you're an enemy, you're an enemy, you're an enemy, you're a friend, you're a friend, you're a good colleague. And that's kind of how I try to navigate. Like, this is a person who's problematic, and I just need to stay away from them and make sure my career is not anywhere near their hands.
Tell me about when you were first starting out. How do you know when to take the time to help a colleague understand when they're being insensitive, or maybe even a manager?
You know, the advice that I give to young people is probably not very good, because I'm a realist. It is. And so I try to give realistic advice, right? I think there's advice where you can tell people, you march into HR and do blah, 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 blah. But often the flip side is, I think you're going to get fired, right? There's a very good chance. People don't appreciate that. So I always try to give people, like, this is the realistic fallout if you do X and Y. I'm never going to pretend like there's not some kind of fallout. So I like cheering people on who do bold and brave things, but also I'm in a much different position. I'm self-employed. I'm wealthy. My company is in my name. I own it 100%. And I pick and choose my projects, and I pick and choose who to work with. That's very different than, I think, the position of people who are starting out in the business, right? I mean, this is my 32nd year. So you get to behave in a different way when you've been around for a minute than if you're brand new. Mm-hmm. I think that I sort of tell people to really kind of play it through, the good and the bad. You know, what do you think is going to happen? And how do you think about telling your manager? What does that mean? Sometimes a better power play is to tell someone else who will tell the manager. You know, often if you're young and you're new, you become that whiny voice. I actually felt when I was at CNN that I was becoming that person who was constantly whining about a lot of our coverage, and it was exhausting. I mean, we would do Latino in America, and I'd say, oh, this is like, I mean, one of our first meetings, we were talking about Latinos. There are 48 million Latinos, 51 if you count 3 million Latinos in Puerto Rico. And the question was, so, you know, are they American, was the question. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, but Puerto Ricans are American, right? Mm-hmm. You could just Google that. Like, we don't even need to spend time in this meeting having that conversation. That's a Google question. You know, and so it's exhausting, right? To be the person who's constantly kind of saying, like, you keep saying Latinos, they, but I'm a Cuban American, right? So it's we, if we're writing this from my point of view, if I'm hosting the doc, if I am the person who's writing this doc, it's not they, it's we. Mm-hmm. This is the point of view of the doc, because I'm anchoring it. You know, and so I find those conversations really do get exhausting after a while, and frustrating. And, you know, by then I was probably 45, right? I've been in the business a long time. I think when you're young, it's a real challenge to be heading those conversations and having them if you're new and you don't really know people. And I do think you get a real reputation for being a raging pain in the ass, and people don't want to work with you. You know, you become, oh, she's good, but oh, she's so annoying. I was bored by me. I was getting sick of myself when I was talking about race all the time, but I thought it was important. And I felt like, if I'm in this room, that's why I'm here, right? I mean, I'm here for this. I'm not sure if I were 20 or 21 and just starting out, that would be sort of surprised, I guess is the word I'd use, by this lack of curiosity. Or when Steve Harvey wrote his book, Think Like a Man, a friend of mine who was producing a primetime show on CNN said to me, so Steve Harvey, would he be good on television? And I said, well, he's got like 12 million radio listeners. I think he'd be a good person. He wrote this book, which was, you remember, right? That was, if they ended up making it into a movie. It wasn't that it was controversial, is not quite the right word, right? But it was kind of sassy. Mm-hmm. And of course, can Steve Harvey talk? He's done stand-up forever. He's been on, you know, sitcoms, right? And I just remember trying to explain to this woman who Steve Harvey was, and kind of like, would he be worth having him on her show, who had something like 170,000 people, viewers, you know, and you're like, so this gatekeeper who literally is going to decide, you know, that Steve Harvey with his 12 million radio listeners, who's been a sitcom star, is a stand-up genius, has been in movies, and this book is about to be turned into a, you know, great movie. Like, but I don't know him. Ergo, he is not worthy of being on. Mm-hmm. Right? Versus, is this a topic that I think is interesting to explore? And that would happen all the time. People just wouldn't know somebody. I'm telling you, if someone said to me, you don't know John Doe, he's got 12 million radio listeners, I'd be like, shoot, what? Who? I never heard of him. How does this person exist? You know, and I think I'm informed, and I've never heard of them. Like, I would be curious to try to figure out how I missed that. One thing I found in newsrooms a lot, certainly among my white colleagues, when it came to other people of other races, they just couldn't imagine, like, they just couldn't imagine that person would be important, right? If I haven't heard of you, you cannot be important. And I think that's a real blocker to the gates of letting people kind of explore new people, right? So if you're doing a show, part of the job is to open up worlds to people, not just sort of feed them the same old stuff that they always know. And so those are good stories, and there are a million more where people just, you know, they couldn't ever be bothered to be curious about other people. Why is the question not, well, who the heck has won it? How did he sell at Madison Square Garden? And I never heard of him? What? Mm-hmm. You know, and I think even in more modern times, there's a great clip of New York Times journalist Maggie Haberman, and she's doing an interview with was a congressman at the time. He's now the Minnesota Attorney General. You know who I'm talking about, Ellison and George Stephanopoulos, right? And George Stephanopoulos says, people think Donald Trump could win this nomination, right? He says that. My constituents, I'm roughly quoting, my constituents believe he could win. And the two of them, fine journalists, burst into hysterical laughter, versus what I think a journalist should do. Why? We don't think he can. Why? I've been covering this race. Why would you think that? That seems absurd. Why? They didn't ask him the key journalistic question. Why? Instead, right, they just burst out laughing like, we're right and you're wrong. And here's a guy who literally is saying, my constituents are worried. He's like red flagging a news story. Mm-hmm. And they're too arrogant and too stuck in their own point of view and mindset to be able to say, well, holy crap. I mean, that makes no sense to me. When people have said that to me in interviews, you're like, what are you talking about? That completely goes against what I think in my head. It's a start of an interview. It certainly doesn't end with me laughing at them and saying, oh, no, person who we've invited on as a guest, you're wrong. And I, comfortably ensconced in my apartment in New York City, I must be right. I think that's a lot of arrogance. And so I think those things really come from a place of arrogance where white journalists don't feel like they need to know those stories. Black journalists need to know those stories and need to know every story, because if you want to move ahead, you better be well-versed in every story. White hairdressers need to be able to do everybody's hair. White hairdressers need to be able to do white people's hair for the most part. I mean, again, this happens very consistently, and this is where I think the analogy is. Black hairdressers need to make sure that they can do the white people's hair, Asian people's hair, black people's hair. You know, I cannot tell you the number of white hairdressers I've had in newsroom situations where someone's been like, I have always wanted to do hair like yours. You're like, oh, girl, no. That will never happen if you're going to put it that way. So again, it's a sense of curiosity and wanting to figure out, which is what I think your job is, to tell stories. But if you think those stories aren't relevant, if you think your audience is all people who look like you, you know, then you clearly haven't gone out in the world enough. I'm out in the world all the time. Before coronavirus, I traveled 150, 175 days a year. So let me promise you, I can tell you, I'm very well aware that people are very different from me. And in some ways, in some places, very similar to me in places that you wouldn't think. So it really is just about curiosity and doing your job.
I think lots of people are waking up to questioning the tenet of objectivity and whether or not that is good or bad. And I think that for better or for worse, there are always going to be some people who hold on to the traditional definition of objectivity and see pushing for diversity in newsrooms as a problem. I wonder, do you see any downside to adding people who are really close to communities or situations and putting their voices into stories?
I think the goal in reporting is to understand an issue, right? So I think that, and to hold people accountable and to grill them as well. So this idea that, I mean, I think it's Peter Baker from the New York Times, I might be wrong, but I think he was one who said, like, he doesn't even have any opinion on anything ever. Well, that's not a very, that's a weird person. And so if you ask me to run out and go do a story on ice cream, I would probably start with, like, listen, I have loved chocolate ice cream my whole life. Every time I go out, I have chocolate ice cream, but I'm being forced today to go out and try to understand these other ice cream flavors. So, and I don't think that ruins my storytelling. I think it gives you an interesting point of view so that at the end, when I come around and say, butter brickle is the best, you're like, oh, interesting. I got to see how her thought process worked. But what she didn't do was try to pretend she didn't have an opinion. Right? She didn't try to sell me on this idea that she's objective on this story when she's not. She has some kind of an opinion. Now, maybe my opinion is irrelevant and doesn't matter. Most of the time, I think the opinion that I have on even hot button issues is a little bit irrelevant. I want to talk to experts. I know it's kind of the death of expertise right now, but I'm interested in what the experts have to say. So if I have an opinion on something, if I have an opinion on the space shuttle program, I'm going to assume the astronauts and people who run the program have a point of view and much more context and value and interesting information than me, who's read a book or two about it, right? So I prefer to have experts, even if I disagree with their opinions. But yes, they were in fact an ambassador to China. So what they say, even if I think they're wrong, they have a credibility that needs to be elevated in this piece. And so I think that that's far more important. I think this idea of objective as having no point of view at all makes no sense, right? The view from nowhere, it's also untrue. Mm-hmm. It's just untrue. And I think what ends up happening is you end up not having a good take on a city or an understanding of a community. So I'd much prefer people who can explain a community to me, right? Who can say, what you have to understand, as they do when I'm in West Louisville, right here, this is, where redlining started. And so that's really going to explain a lot of the crap you're going to see. Like, it comes from a place. You need to understand that. Not understanding that, sort of being, ahistoric on where people come from and what they've been dealing with and what has happened in their own backyard, I think is a failure as a reporter. It's not a plus. Mm-hmm. So I think, again, every single story has a different point of view and a different tone in how you think about it. But I do believe that this idea of being completely objective gets us a lot of these, like, glowing portraits of neo-Nazis, right? They're just like us. They have babies and whatever, versus the person doesn't think that their views are abhorrent. The person doesn't think, there's a very glowing piece. I'm picking on the New York Times today, but why not? Because we're here. I think it's Ben Smith, who I really admire. I like him personally. I like his work. But, he writes about Andrew Sullivan, and Andrew Sullivan writes a lot of racist crap. Andrew Sullivan's most popular tweets were about black men's penis size. Like, literally, I'm not even, yes, it's insane. But for clearly for Ben, right, that doesn't signal to him that this person has been promoting racist theories and genetic theories about race that are racist for a long, long time. I think he's kind of, he finds it interesting. So I think you'd get a different interview with somebody else, grilling Andrew about some of the really ridiculous things that he has said.
I'm going to go to the chat and pick out a question now. I see Nisha McCoy asking, what do you think about the state of journalism under our current president?
I think journalism is frequently very, very good. I think our White House correspondents and the people who are covering politics are embarrassingly bad most of the time. I think there is, you know, here's a good example. I'm sorry, there's a fly in my apartment, in my house, and it's driving me crazy. I think a very good example would be a guy who who's the ABC correspondent who works in the White House, who wrote a book called Front Row at the Trump Show. So imagine writing a book that the title, and you're talking about your own job, is Front Row at the Trump Show. Your job as a White House correspondent, which is one of the most powerful, important, accountability, holding people in power, accountable jobs you can come up with. You're going to call that the front row at the Trump Show? I think that's actually sad. It actually breaks my heart that, and I'm sure somebody talked him into that title and they thought that's what's going to sell. That's a sad thing. I would never do that. So I think we have a lot of these White House correspondents who are both trying to do their jobs, but also trying to sell the bizarre era that we're in and market it as a selling point. So we know Chris Cillizza's writing a book about President Trump's love of sports. That was announced today from what I could tell. You know, do you believe that that person is going to ask tough questions of the president, who he also needs a quote from for his book? I believe that right there is a conflict. So while everybody else is talking about you need to make sure that you don't have opinion on things, I think we're also seeing a lot of our White House correspondents fully recognizing that they can get access, they can get an interesting story. Look at every single person who's left the White House administration suddenly is penning a book, being interviewed, you know, gets their 15 minutes of fame saying something that they could have said, you know, if they were really found it morally important while they were there, but they didn't stand up. They didn't say the thing that they're saying today. Today they do it because they're getting paid. They can make speeches, they can make money. So I think we're in a very troubling time. I think the White House Correspondents Association and the White House correspondents, many of those correspondents are pathetic. Their questions are bad. They do a poor job. They are not good at their jobs. And I think we see that day in and day out.
Wow. What would you like to see from the White House correspondent?
Well, for one thing, I think if somebody's asking a question, the next correspondent who comes in should pick up on that question. No one should ask a challenging question and then drop it to ask a completely unrelated, stupid question afterwards. They ask a lot of yes, no questions. I don't think they do a good job. And listen, I promise you, you do not have to take my word for it. Anytime there is a press conference, just go listen in. Spend the next, you'll have a couple of stars. Yamiche, I think, is fantastic. There's a handful of very good people. A lot of women are solid. And then a lot who are terrible. And so there's a handful of very solid reporters who I think do a good job. But for the most part, I think it's pretty poor. And I'm not the only one who says that. I think a lot of people say it. It used to be a very important job, but I think they today are run around by Trump and they don't really try to get answers to questions. They try to make news. And I think that's problematic.
I'm going back to the chat. I have a question from Bansari Kadmar. How do you deal with the added burden of proof asked of journalists of color that accompanies covering stories about racism? Obviously now you have put yourself in a position where you say yes and no to whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I don't think there's an added burden of proof. I mean, again, I think it really depends on where you want to work and if you feel like you're valued by your bosses. You know, I think when I worked in San Francisco, I remember coming into the office. One of the maybe the tunnel, the bridges was down, so everybody had to drive through Oakland to come in. I was the Oakland bureau chief. I was really the only reporter in Oakland, but I was in Oakland and I was in San Francisco for the day. And so all the producers had to come in. Everybody came in like, oh, I just drove through Oakland. Oh my God, I took my life in my own hands by driving through Oakland. And I remember thinking, as a person who lived in Oakland, I had just come in for the day for a meeting. Like, these are the people who are going to start doing the morning meeting, which is going to dictate our coverage. And listen to them, the joke, get it? Do you get the joke, right? The joke is, I drove through Oakland and nearly died. And of course, no one's driving through Oakland. It's a 5-lane, 6-lane highway. So it's not like anybody's driving in the streets. And by the way, I live in Oakland. This is how I felt at the time. You know, and I was thinking, like, this is so crazy. that they're both going to decide the content for covering Oakland, but also they're here kind of mocking Oakland at the same time. And at that moment, I knew I would leave. I wasn't going to leave soon. I had a contract. I liked the job, and I had a lot to learn there. But, you know, when you realize very clearly, like, oh, this is what this is about, that there's a narrative that's going to have to be matched. If you want to be the Oakland reporter, there's going to be stories about Oakland that you're going to have to, like, it makes sense, right? Here's what everybody thinks about Oakland. Now, every so often people run a counter narrative. Oh, there's a foster mom who had 15 foster children, and isn't she amazing? But mostly Oakland's going to be about poverty and crime, et cetera, right? Because you could tell the people in the leadership, that morning meeting, who will decide the content, who certainly was not a diverse group of people, but also not even diverse geographically. Like, no one lived in Oakland. I just happened to be in for the day. I wasn't even part of that meeting. Usually I was just a reporter. And I think what ends up happening, if you don't figure it out, you're going to lose people who can go on to other things. You'll keep the people who can't go anywhere, but you'll lose the people who can go get other jobs. I think Wesley Lowery is a really good example of a great reporter who, you know, really pushed back on this idea of, like, why is this person objective, but I'm not? Why are you saying that this is an interesting point of view? He's a very smart and very thoughtful about how he writes about race. And I think he asks uncomfortable questions. You know, why should people in this community that I'm covering believe the press when the press, you know, doesn't do a fair job in covering them? I get it. I get it. I used to get asked all the time when I worked at CNN and we were doing a doc called Latino in America. You know, so you're doing this doc called Latino in America, but Lou Dobbs is on every night vilifying Latinos. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, so you're playing both sides, literally. You are, you know, trying to get us as viewers, but also happy to use us as a punching bag, as long as it's on Lou's show. They weren't wrong. They were right. You know, so this idea that somehow there's this sense of, well, you know, I'm a neutral person trying to navigate a space. I understand when people don't buy that, you know, that there is an agenda at times around the audience that they think is valuable and the audience that they want.
Mm-hmm. And did I hear you say that you don't think that there's an added burden for reporters of color?
You know, again, I don't think there is, unless you want to take one on. Mm. And I don't think you have to take one on. I think the goal is to do a good job. The goal in anything, and I don't care what you're reporting on, if you're obsessed with European soccer, then you probably should have your editor or a friend or another producer eyeball your piece on European soccer. I love European soccer. Have I gone too crazy? Like, is this too inside baseball? Because I love soccer, right? Like, that's what you do when you want to make sure you're doing a good job. I don't think there's an added burden. I think there's an intelligence around, I have some value to add because I'm very ensconced in this community. Of course I should be talking about it. So I don't know that there's an added burden that you have to take on. I think the goal is always the same, to do a good job. And maybe burden is the word I don't like. I think you have added insight, added opportunity, added expertise, added ability to sit down with people and talk to them about an issue. I think those are all pluses most of the time. Mm-hmm. I think when I was reporting Black in America, the fact that I was Black was very helpful. I think people wanted to talk about race with me. I don't think they would have done it in a way if I had been a white woman kind of trying to figure out this story. But I also think I had added insight in the conversation. So I think it's a plus, not a minus. I don't think it's a burden.
Mm-hmm. I'm going back to the chat. Liliana Soto asks, is there any advice for a journalist with an accent in English news? What's your take on changing how you sound to fit in? I want you to touch on, please, 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 when you were first looking for a job and you were calling your mom, because it's so affirming to young journalists that you're calling your mom and saying, Mom, this man said my name kind of funny and he asked if I was going to change it, and your mom is just giving you encouragement as you're trying to figure out where you fit.
I was trying to get an on-air job, and they did. They wanted me to change my name from Soledad O'Brien because they thought Soledad would be too hard for people to say. And by the way, I'm from Long Island, so I had a Long Island accent. Was really, I mean, by the way, I'm sure that Liliana's accent is far better than my Long Island accent ever was. You know, I think it really depends, accent-wise, on if it's distracting or not. I think some accents are distracting and some are not. My Long Island accent was, I thought, distracting. So NBC sent me to a speech person where I had to go and do all my vocal prep to practice, which over time helped me lose my accent. So now I have a non-accent. Every so often on certain words, I fall back into my accent. I think it gives you more flexibility. Like if you were in my house having a glass of wine with me, I'd be like, I don't know. Do you want to go work in Minnesota? Do you want to go work in places where everybody will feel like they want to hear a non-accent from their reporters? Then you might want to work on losing your accent. If you feel like, I like my accent and I think it's a big part of me and I want to hang on to it, then I'd say hang on to it. And then it becomes a part of you. I think it's really kind of a personal decision. I was from Long Island. My Long Island accent wasn't super strong, but I was from Long Island, which meant I said coffee and call me and talk and oh my God, and it's hysterical and all those things. Like that's me, not cute. So I lost my accent and now I have a very neutral non-accent. It just took a handful of classes and consistent work on it, but it's not brain surgery. But I think it's much more of a question around, do you like your accent and does it give you the flexibility to work in the markets where you'd like to work?
Mm-hmm. I am wondering if I become a news manager. Well, not me, because I'm a person of color. If I'm a white person and I'm a news manager who believes in the potential of journalism to right wrongs and tell truths and shine a light on inequities, and I want to support the reporters of color that I manage, what's the best way for me to help those people?
I think the best way to help people, especially if they're young, is to give them opportunity. Opportunity to succeed, opportunity to fail, opportunity to come back from failures, right? One reason I was successful was people just gave me a chance to do stuff. And most of the time I did pretty well. And when I screwed it up, usually they were nice enough to give me a second chance. It's not brain surgery. You figure it out. You figure out what your skills are. You figure out what your strengths are. There are things that I really, really love to do. I love being in the field. I love reporting. I love traveling. But you can't get good at it until you get to do it a lot and do it again and do it again and do it again and do it again. And I think what ends up happening frequently is people don't want to give opportunities to people of color so that they, that if you don't get a chance, then the moment you get the chance, if you can't rise to the occasion, and often it's hard to do it perfectly the first time, then you don't really get to grow in the job. So I was always very lucky that I got a lot of opportunities. So I think any news manager who wants people to be successful, it's what I do with my team. I have 11 full-time employees. The people who started as my production assistants start working as producers on projects in areas in which they get to learn. And if they make a mistake, it doesn't kill the whole project. We all say, oh, that was a mistake, and we move on and we fix it. And by the time they're done, they're now a producer or an associate producer because someone gave them a chance and now they could go be a producer. I think it's just about giving people opportunities and believing in them and then giving them the support to make sure that they can succeed in that opportunity. And I don't think that's just for journalism. I think that's for every single job. Give people a chance, help them to succeed, back them up and support them, and make sure that they get to the next level.
And now that, again, more people are coming to understand that racism intersects with lots of other issues and they're assigning more coverage around race in stories. The other part of this is that in your op-ed, you did say that the CNN news manager stayed on the sidelines the entire time that you were doing your Black in America and Latina in America series. What's the way to support them in the racism journalism that they're doing?
Again, I think a lot of it, and not just journalism around race and racism, I think in journalism in general, one of the greatest things about a newsroom is a bunch of smart people batting ideas around. It's what I loved about a newsroom, was that people would sit around and be like, yes, but is it true? Do we believe that? What do we think? And they had to support their idea, or they could not support their idea. And if they were able to support it, it would go on to become a story or maybe a series. If they couldn't support it, it would kind of go away. The whole pitch process. So I think it's around making sure you're involved in the conversation, making sure that you are pushing people to do the best job. One of the issues we had when we started doing Black in America, I remember we got to a point where we did a great story on these Black doctors, But it felt to me after that series, after that second part of the series, like people were just doing like good Black people doing good things. And that's not what Black in America was. Listen, I'm all about good Black people doing good things. I know good white people doing good things and good Asian people doing good things, good Native, I mean, I don't care. I think it's all good. All good people doing good things, yay for them. But the series, right, was digging into complications. And I think people started dumbing it down a little bit. And so I really wanted to make sure that the quality of what we were doing never faltered. Like it had to be challenging. When you interview people, it had to feel like, oh, they weren't sure what the answer was. You know, so doing what I consider to be like news you can use, or here's a great story about a woman who's been a foster mom for 20 kids. That's great. It is great. Good for her. I fully cheer her on. But that's not what we were doing, right? We were doing the complications in those stories. And so I think you have to hold yourself to a very high standard to make sure you're not saying, well, it's about race. Let's just do it. When we were doing Black in America one year, we were doing, I think 6 pieces, and it's an hour doc for Black in America. And one of the pieces was about a white lady who worked with kids whose parents had gone to prison. And it was a great story. She was phenomenal. I think Lifetime even did a movie about her. She was amazing. But she's not a Black person. And I was like, this documentary series is called Black in America. And by having 5 Black people and 1 white lady, you're telling everybody that you can't find 6 people to be the stars of Black in America. We do 1 documentary every year. So go and find Black people who are doing things in their community. Go and find it. That's the, you know, and I remember I got so much pushback on that, but I remember thinking like, oh, I'm 100% right on this. You know, what you can't do is call it Black in America and then say, well, we're going to throw some other people in as well. By the way, that woman's story was amazing and should definitely air 100%. We had done a great interview with her and I was happy to do a piece on her. She was amazing. But it's not the story of Black in America, I think. And so I think you have to really hold these stories to a high standard and make sure you're not just doing, oh, it's Women's Month, and so we're just going to do great stories on women, but you're going to tackle the challenging issues around gender diversity and the tough stories. That's the much harder thing to do and the more challenging thing to do. And I think that holding people accountable on that front is very important.
I want to turn to the topic of multi-ethnic identities, which is funny, even though we're struggling with race and ethnicity as like single identifiers. But I think Kamala Harris's historic nomination exposed the complexity around people who identify with more than one group. And I think you're particularly interesting because I've heard you say that you don't subscribe to the boxes that other people create for you. What are you wishing that media does moving forward with respect to people who are multi-ethnic and identify with multiple groups?
Again, it's not brain surgery, right? I mean, there are...
You say that, but here we are.
I know, but you know, we did a doc once about, and I remember we were booking the panel and one of the producers came up to me very panicked. The little boy who was Black, his mom was on the panel and she was white. And I'm like, yeah. He's like, yeah, but they lied. They said he's Black. And I'm like, he's a little Black boy. His mom is white. Like, are you an idiot? I mean, you know, in this day and age, I just couldn't believe it. And so I would say it's not brain surgery. It really is not. It's just, you clearly just don't understand the issues, right? I mean, again, it's the same conversation I had. I remember my husband, we had a dinner once and one of his colleagues said to me, oh, your husband lets you work. I was like, yeah, exactly. What you just did, that's what I did. I was like, I remember my husband being like, calm down, Nellie, hold up. Don't punch this 80-year-old man. But, you know, like people back then, just the idea, right, that he had in his head was that women don't work if their spouses don't allow it. Like, we need to move forward in multiracial and multi-ethnic identity. It's not the quadratic equation. It's freaking, there's race, there's ethnicity, it can all be jumbled and mumbled together. It's not complicated. And again, reporters, I guess I hold them to a higher standard. If you're out in the world, you begin to understand, right? Like, oh, white people from Panama. Oh, black people from Panama. White Cubans, black Cubans, black looking Cubans who tell me they're white. Brazilians who swear they're white, who we'd be like, you look black. Like clearly it's a very, I guess what I've always liked about the issue is it's complicated and it allows for good questions. But journalists have to kind of allow themselves to sit in it and understand it. And so, you know, the idea that a reporter or a producer who was working on this issue, it kind of confused him that a little brown boy could have a white mom when the anchor of the entire thing was a brown lady with a black mom and a white dad, right? Like, I don't know. I guess, I don't know. It saddens me that people haven't been out in the world enough, and their job, again, is to be curious and understanding of people.
Our time is winding down. I want to make sure that I ask, what are you reading right now? And what's giving you hope right now?
So well, like everybody else, I kind of redid my office because we're stuck in a location that's not my real office for coronavirus. So I was like, oh my God, this little space actually now needs to be a functioning office. Right now I'm in my bedroom, but my office is being done. So what that means, I've been digging through my books in the bookshelf. And so I'm reading a lot of things that I haven't read for a very long time, like all of the classics, like The Great Gatsby. Usually you read The Great Gatsby because someone has assigned it.
Right.
But I've actually reading The Great Gatsby because I just found it. I'm like, oh my, you know, I never actually read The Great Gatsby when I was in high school. So I'm reading it now. I've been on a very big kick of Joseph Heller and Kurt Vonnegut. So Catch-22 is what I'm reading now. And then I'm also been reading a lot of Kurt Vonnegut, but only because I've got bags and bags of books that I'm trying to move into a bookshelf. And I'm like, oh, I never read this. Oh, I never read this. Oh, I never read this. So it's really the classics. And I guess I feel like, shoot, I should have read this. I was supposed to read this. Everyone read this, but I haven't yet.
And what's giving you hope?
Not a whole heck of a lot, to be honest. I've been woefully disappointed in people. Woefully disappointed in journalists. I think younger journalists give me a lot of hope because I think they're very interested in holding people accountable. And so I would sort of say to them, like, get all the skills down. Don't run in the door, you know, with ideas blazing around how I'm going to take down this and take down that. I think it's around understand, how does a show work? What's the structure of an interview? How do you do the job? Those things are very important. So I think young people probably more than anything give me hope because the journalists of my age group are usually sorely disappointing.